Night falls over Rome, and the city's familiar chaos gives way to a hush of anticipation. The imperial palace, perched high above the flickering torches of the Forum, glows with 1,000 lamps, its marble walls casting long shadows across the gardens below. From the outside, the palace is a fortress of order and power, guarded by silent sentries and the weight of tradition. But as the city settles into uneasy sleep, a different world awakens behind those gilded doors, a world where the rules of the day are left behind, and the boundaries of pleasure, loyalty, and ambition are redrawn with every passing hour. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of incense and wine. Courtiers in silk and gold slip through hidden corridors, their laughter echoing off mosaic floors. Musicians tune their lyres in candlelit alcoves, while servants prepare trays of delicacies for guests whose names are whispered with both awe and fear. At the heart of it all sits the emperor, a figure both adored and dreaded, whose every whim can change the fate of a nation or a single life. Tonight, as on so many nights, he has summoned his favorites, his rivals, and his most beautiful companions for a gathering that will blur the line between celebration and spectacle. But beneath the music and the masks, tension simmers. Every guest knows that the palace is a stage, and that the emperor is both director and audience. A careless word, a jealous glance, or a moment of hesitation can mean exile, disgrace, or worse. For some, the night promises opportunity, a chance to win favor, to forge alliances, or to indulge in forbidden pleasures. For others, it is a gauntlet of anxiety, a test of loyalty and survival in a world where secrets are currency and trust is a dangerous luxury. What really happened behind the curtains of the imperial palace? How did one man's hunger for novelty and control turn Rome's most sacred halls into a theater of excess? And what price did his companions, and the empire itself, pay for a few fleeting nights of pleasure? As we step into the shadows of the emperor's world, prepare to discover a story of power, loneliness, and the human cost of unchecked desire. Stay with us, because the secrets of the palace are darker and more revealing than you've ever imagined. To understand how the imperial palace became a stage for excess, we must first step into the world that surrounded it, a world teetering between glory and collapse. Rome in the age of the emperors was a city of breathtaking contrasts. Its streets bustled with merchants, philosophers, and soldiers from every corner of the known world. Marble temples and triumphal arches proclaimed the empire's might, while the slums and tenements of the Suburra seethed with poverty, crime, and unrest. The city's wealth was built on conquest and slavery, its peace maintained by the ever-present threat of violence. At the center of this vast, volatile empire stood the emperor, a man both worshipped and feared, whose every decision could ripple across continents. The emperor was more than a ruler. He was a living symbol of Rome's destiny, a god in human form. Statues of his likeness adorned every forum and temple, and his image was stamped on every coin. Yet, beneath the marble and gold, the emperor was also a man beset by anxieties and expectations that few could imagine. He was expected to be a military genius, a wise judge, a pious priest, and a generous patron. He was the father of the nation, the arbiter of fashion, and the ultimate source of justice. Every triumph was his to claim, but every failure was his to bear alone. The emperor's private life was never truly private. Courtiers, senators, and spies watched his every move, eager to curry favor or catch a misstep. The Senate, though stripped of real power, remained a nest of intrigue, its members ready to praise or betray the emperor as the winds shifted. The people of Rome, too, were fickle, cheering their ruler in the circus one day, cursing him in the streets the next. The emperor's family was often his greatest source of danger. Wives, mothers, and siblings jockeyed for influence, while distant cousins plotted in the shadows. It was in this atmosphere of constant scrutiny and pressure that the seeds of excess were sown. The emperor's palace was both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where he could indulge his desires but never escape the burden of expectation. Surrounded by flatterers and rivals, the emperor learned to trust no one fully. The loneliness of absolute power was profound, and the temptation to seek solace in pleasure, novelty, or spectacle was ever present. The emperor at the heart of our story did not begin as a monster. He was born into privilege, raised on tales of Rome's greatness, and taught from an early age that his destiny was to rule. But as he ascended the throne, he found himself trapped by the very system that had created him. Every gesture was interpreted, every rumor magnified. The pressure to be both more than human and less than himself, to be a living god, yet always on display, was relentless. In this world, the boundaries between public and private, sacred and profane, were constantly shifting. The emperor's excesses were not simply personal failings. They were symptoms of a society obsessed with power, spectacle, and the illusion of control. The palace became a microcosm of Rome itself, dazzling, dangerous, and always on the brink of chaos. As we move forward, we'll see how the emperor's need for escape and affirmation led him down a path of ever greater indulgence, and how the city around him, hungry for distraction and scandal, became both his enabler and his judge. The stage was set for a scandal that would shake the empire to its core. The first whispers began as little more than gossip, servants exchanging knowing glances, senators trading rumors in the shadowed corners of the forum. At first, the gatherings in the imperial palace were described as exclusive feasts, private entertainments for the emperor's closest friends and confidants. But as the nights grew longer and the guest lists more selective, the stories took on a darker edge. What began as lavish banquets soon became something else entirely, a series of secret, intoxicating spectacles that would come to define the emperor's reign. The origins of the palace orgies were rooted in both tradition and innovation. Roman elites had long used feasting and revelry as tools of power, forging alliances and testing loyalties over wine and song. But the emperor, restless and increasingly isolated, sought more than mere camaraderie. He craved novelty, excitement, and the thrill of transgression. Surrounded by flatterers and rivals, he began to invite only those who would indulge his every whim: beautiful courtesans, ambitious senators, artists, and entertainers whose talents extended far beyond the stage. The first gatherings were marked by a sense of liberation. Freed from the constraints of public life, guests shed their inhibitions along with their togas. The palace's grand halls were transformed into theaters of sensation. Musicians played haunting melodies, dancers moved with hypnotic grace, and masked performers enacted scenes of myth and fantasy. The emperor presided over it all, his laughter echoing through the corridors as he urged his guests to outdo one another in wit, daring, and pleasure. But as the orgies grew in scale and notoriety, so too did the risks. The line between entertainment and excess blurred, and the emperor's appetite for spectacle became insatiable. What had once been playful dares turned into elaborate games of seduction and humiliation. Favors were granted and withdrawn on a whim, and the price of falling out of favor could be exile or worse. The palace became a labyrinth of secrets, where every guest was both a participant and a potential informant. Rumors spread quickly through Rome. Some claimed the emperor had imported exotic dancers from the farthest reaches of the empire. Others whispered of forbidden rituals and midnight ceremonies that mocked the gods. The city buzzed with speculation. Who had been invited? Who had been excluded? And what truly happened behind the palace's closed doors? The emperor's enemies seized on the scandal, using it to undermine his authority and stoke public outrage. Even his allies began to wonder how far he would go, and what dangers might be unleashed if the orgies continued unchecked. Beneath the surface, deeper psychological motives simmered. The emperor's need for control, his fear of betrayal, and his longing for genuine connection all played out in the theater of excess he had created. For some guests, the orgies were a chance to rise in the emperor's favor. For others, they were a test of loyalty, a gauntlet of temptation and risk. The palace became a crucible, forging alliances and rivalries that would shape the fate of Rome itself. As the scandal grew, so did the stakes. The emperor's palace was no longer just a symbol of power. It was a powder keg, ready to explode. And as we move behind the closed doors of these infamous gatherings, we'll see how the rituals, games, and shifting alliances inside the palace would push everyone involved to their limits, and set the stage for a downfall that would echo through history. As dusk deepened into night, the imperial palace transformed into a world apart, a place where the ordinary rules of Roman life no longer applied. Behind closed doors, the emperor's private chambers became a stage for rituals and games that blurred the line between performance and reality, pleasure and peril. Each evening, the chosen guests would gather in anticipation, their hearts pounding with a mix of excitement and dread. For some, the invitation was a mark of favor. For others, it was a summons they dared not refuse. The night would begin with a ritual of entry. Guests, masked and robed, would be led through torchlit corridors by silent attendants. At the threshold, they would be asked to surrender their names and titles, adopting new identities for the night, gods, heroes, or mythic lovers. This shedding of status was both liberating and unsettling, a signal that what happened within these walls would remain secret, unbound by the expectations of the outside world. Inside, the palace was transformed into a theater of sensation. Musicians played haunting melodies on lyres and flutes, their notes weaving through the air like a spell. Dancers, draped in silk and gold, moved with hypnotic grace, enacting scenes from legend and fantasy. The emperor, seated on a raised dais, presided over the spectacle with a watchful eye, his mood setting the tone for the night. Sometimes he demanded laughter and revelry. Other times, he craved drama, confession, or even tears. The games themselves were as varied as the emperor's whims. Drinking contests and riddles gave way to more elaborate challenges. A guest might be asked to recite a poem, perform a daring feat, or act out a scene of seduction or betrayal. Alliances formed and dissolved in the flicker of torchlight, as guests vied for the emperor's attention or sought to outshine their rivals. The stakes were high: favor, gifts, and influence for the winners, humiliation, exile, or worse for those who failed to please. At the heart of these rituals was the emperor's need for control and novelty. Surrounded by flatterers and spies, he craved genuine emotion, unpredictable drama, and the thrill of pushing boundaries. The palace became his laboratory, the guests his subjects. He watched for signs of fear, desire, or rebellion, rewarding those who surprised him and punishing those who disappointed. For the emperor, each night was a test, not just of his guests, but of his own power to shape reality and bend others to his will. For the participants, the psychological impact was profound. The constant pressure to perform, to anticipate the emperor's desires, and to navigate the shifting alliances of the court left many in a state of perpetual anxiety. Some learned to play the game, adopting masks of wit, charm, or submission to survive. Others retreated inward, numbing themselves to the emotional toll or seeking solace in fleeting moments of connection. The line between pleasure and pain, freedom and captivity, grew ever more blurred. Yet, for all its dangers, the theater of excess also offered moments of genuine intimacy and revelation. In the anonymity of the mask, guests could confess secrets, express forbidden desires, or forge unexpected bonds. The rituals became a space where the hidden parts of the self could be explored, at least until the dawn, when the masks came off and the old hierarchies reasserted themselves. As the night wore on, the palace would echo with laughter, music, and the occasional cry of anguish. The emperor, ever restless, would move among his guests, bestowing favors or delivering rebukes with a word or a glance. By morning, the survivors would slip away, their faces pale with exhaustion or flushed with triumph, their minds haunted by memories they could never share. But the games could not last forever. The need for ever greater novelty, the growing sense of danger, and the shifting tides of loyalty and fear would soon push the emperor and his court to the brink. In the next section, we'll meet the favorites, rivals, and lovers whose fates were bound to the emperor's pleasure, and discover the true price of living at the heart of Rome's most dangerous theater. Within the palace's gilded walls, the emperor's inner circle was a world unto itself, a volatile mix of favorites, lovers, and rivals, each vying for a place in the emperor's fickle affections. To be chosen as a favorite was to bask in the glow of imperial favor. Gifts, titles, and influence flowed freely, and the chosen few became the envy of Rome. But the same proximity to power that brought privilege also brought peril, for the emperor's attention was as unpredictable as it was intoxicating. The favorites were a diverse and dazzling group. Some were celebrated courtesans, renowned for their wit and beauty. Others were ambitious senators, skilled in the art of flattery and intrigue. There were poets whose verses delighted the emperor, athletes whose strength and grace captivated him, and even slaves whose loyalty or daring caught his eye. Each was drawn into the emperor's orbit by a different path, but all shared the same hope: to secure a lasting place in his heart and, by extension, in the machinery of power. But the emperor's love was a double-edged sword. The same qualities that won his favor, charm, intelligence, audacity, could just as easily provoke his jealousy or suspicion. A careless word, a moment of hesitation, or a rival's whispered accusation could turn delight into disaster. The palace was a crucible of shifting alliances, where friendships were forged and broken in the space of a single night. Lovers became adversaries, confidants became informants, and every gesture was scrutinized for signs of loyalty or betrayal. Beneath the surface, the struggle for influence was relentless. Favorites competed for the emperor's attention with gifts, performances, and ever more daring displays of devotion. Some sought to undermine their rivals with subtle slights or calculated rumors, while others formed secret pacts, hoping to outmaneuver the rest. The emperor, for his part, encouraged the competition, delighting in the drama and using it to test the limits of his power. He would lavish praise on one guest, only to turn cold the next day. He would promise protection, then withdraw it without warning. The cost of falling out of favor was steep. Those who displeased the emperor could find themselves banished from the palace, stripped of their titles, or worse. Some were sent into exile, their names erased from public memory. Others met more violent ends, their bodies found in the Tiber or their deaths disguised as accidents. Even those who survived the emperor's wrath often found themselves shunned by former friends, their fortunes ruined and their reputations in tatters. Yet, for all the risks, the lure of the emperor's circle was irresistible. The chance to shape policy, to influence the fate of Rome, or simply to enjoy the pleasures of the palace was too great a temptation for many to resist. Some played the game with skill and cunning, rising and falling with the tides of fortune. Others were destroyed by their own ambition, their stories serving as cautionary tales for those who followed. The psychological toll on the emperor's favorites was immense. The constant need to perform, to anticipate the emperor's desires, and to guard against rivals left many in a state of perpetual anxiety. Some became adept at wearing masks, hiding their true feelings behind a facade of wit or charm. Others retreated into themselves, numbed by the emotional roller coaster of life at court. The line between pleasure and pain, love and fear, grew ever more blurred. But the greatest danger was yet to come. As the emperor's appetites grew more extravagant and his trust more elusive, the palace became a powder keg of suspicion and resentment. In the next section, we'll see how the whispers of scandal and outrage spread beyond the palace walls, fueling both public fascination and private terror, and setting the stage for a reckoning that would shake Rome to its core. As the emperor's palace became a theater of nightly excess, the boundaries between private scandal and public spectacle began to dissolve. What happened behind closed doors could not be contained by marble walls or loyal guards. Servants, musicians, and even favored guests carried stories into the city, sometimes as warnings, sometimes as boasts, and sometimes as currency in the endless game of Roman politics. Soon, the whispers of what transpired in the imperial chambers became the talk of every tavern, bathhouse, and marketplace in Rome. For many citizens, the tales were a source of outrage. Rome prided itself on its traditions, its discipline, and its sense of order. The idea that the emperor, supposed to be the father of the nation and the guardian of its values, was presiding over orgies and spectacles of excess struck at the heart of Roman identity. Senators and moralists decried the decline of virtue, warning that the emperor's behavior would bring ruin to the city. Pamphlets and satirical poems circulated in secret, lampooning the palace and its denizens. Even the most powerful families began to distance themselves, fearing that association with the emperor's inner circle could taint their own reputations. Yet, beneath the outrage, there was also a current of fascination. The same citizens who condemned the emperor's excesses in public were often eager to hear every detail in private. The stories of masked banquets, daring performances, and shifting alliances became a kind of forbidden entertainment, a way to escape the monotony of daily life and imagine a world where anything was possible. For some, the palace orgies were a symbol of decadence and decline. For others, they were a tantalizing glimpse of freedom and possibility, a world where the usual rules did not apply. The impact on Roman politics was profound. The emperor's enemies seized on the scandal, using it to rally opposition and undermine his authority. Senators who had once vied for invitations to the palace now whispered of conspiracy and betrayal. Ambitious generals and provincial governors began to plot, sensing that the emperor's grip on power was slipping. The city itself became a stage for intrigue, as factions formed and dissolved in response to the latest rumors from the palace. Culturally, the scandal left its mark as well. Artists and playwrights found inspiration in the tales of excess, creating works that both mocked and celebrated the emperor's court. The boundaries of taste and decency were tested in the theater and the forum, as performers pushed the limits of what could be said or shown in public. For the young and ambitious, the palace remained a beacon, a place where fortunes could be made or lost in a single night. For the old and cautious, it was a warning of how quickly the world could change. The emperor's reputation, once a source of awe and reverence, became a lightning rod for every anxiety and hope in the city. To some, he was a monster, a tyrant whose appetites threatened to destroy Rome. To others, he was a tragic figure, a man undone by the very power he had sought to wield. The truth, as always, was more complicated. The emperor was both a product and a prisoner of his time, caught between the demands of tradition and the temptations of novelty. As the whispers grew louder and the city's mood grew darker, the stage was set for a reckoning. The palace, once a sanctuary of pleasure and privilege, became a fortress besieged by suspicion and fear. In the next section, we'll follow the emperor's descent into paranoia and isolation, and see how the very excesses that once brought him adoration would ultimately lead to his undoing. As the scandal of the palace orgies spread through Rome, the emperor's world began to shrink. The laughter and music that once filled the marble halls now echoed with suspicion. Every glance, every whisper, every shadow in the corridor became a potential threat. The emperor, once the center of a glittering court, found himself surrounded by masks, faces that smiled in the candlelight but hid secrets in the dark. The very games he had orchestrated to assert his power now became traps, ensnaring him in a web of doubt and fear. The first signs of paranoia were subtle. The emperor began to change the guest list for his nightly gatherings, excluding old favorites and inviting new faces whose loyalty was untested. Trusted advisors were dismissed on the slightest suspicion, replaced by flatterers who told him only what he wanted to hear. The palace, once a place of revelry, became a fortress. Guards were doubled, doors were locked, and secret passages were watched day and night. The emperor's private chambers, once open to laughter and music, became silent sanctuaries where he paced alone, haunted by the ghosts of betrayal. The consequences rippled outward. The inner circle, once bound by shared pleasure and ambition, fractured into rival factions. Old friends became enemies, and alliances shifted with every rumor. Some courtiers fled the palace, seeking safety in distant provinces or the protection of powerful patrons. Others stayed, hoping to weather the storm or profit from the chaos. The emperor's lovers, once the objects of envy and desire, now lived in fear, knowing that a single misstep could mean disgrace or death. The city of Rome, too, felt the change. The people, who had once gossiped about the palace with a mix of outrage and fascination, now watched with growing unease. Bread and circuses no longer distracted from the sense that something was deeply wrong at the heart of the empire. The Senate, emboldened by the emperor's weakness, began to plot in earnest. Generals whispered of rebellion, and the city's mood turned from curiosity to dread. For the emperor, the psychological toll was devastating. The pleasures that had once brought him solace now seemed hollow, tainted by suspicion and regret. He became obsessed with omens and prophecies, consulting astrologers and priests in search of reassurance. Night after night, he replayed the events of the past, searching for the moment when control had slipped from his grasp. Sleep eluded him, and his health began to fail. The man who had once commanded the loyalty of an empire now trusted no one, not even himself. Yet, even as his world unraveled, the emperor clung to the rituals of excess. The orgies continued, but the laughter was forced, the games more cruel. Guests competed not for pleasure, but for survival, each trying to outwit the others and avoid the emperor's wrath. The palace became a stage for paranoia, a place where every gesture was a test, every word a potential weapon. The breaking point was inevitable. As the emperor's isolation deepened, His enemies closed in. The city buzzed with rumors of plots and poison, of secret meetings and midnight assassins. The emperor, once the master of Rome, became its prisoner, trapped by the very excesses that had once made him untouchable. But the final act had yet to be played. In the next section, we'll witness the emperor's downfall, betrayal by those he trusted most, the eruption of scandal, and the collapse of a reign that had begun in glory and ended in ruin. The story of the emperor who turned his palace into an orgy was about to reach its tragic conclusion, and the lessons it left behind would haunt Rome for generations. The emperor's downfall began not with a single act of treachery, but with a slow unraveling, a web of secrets, resentments, and ambitions tightening around him as his world shrank. The very people who had once vied for his favor now whispered behind closed doors, their loyalty eroded by fear and self-preservation. The palace, once a sanctuary of pleasure and power, became a crucible of suspicion. Every gesture was scrutinized, every word weighed for hidden meaning. The emperor, isolated and exhausted, could no longer tell friend from foe. The final betrayal came from within his own circle. A trusted advisor, long overlooked and underestimated, began to gather allies among the disaffected courtiers and ambitious senators. Promises were made in shadowy corridors: protection, advancement, a return to order, if only the emperor could be removed. The plot grew, fed by the emperor's own paranoia and the mounting outrage in the city. When the moment came, it was swift and merciless. The emperor was confronted in his private chambers, surrounded by those he had once called friends. There was no dramatic struggle, no last stand, just a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to a reign that had burned so brightly and so dangerously. The eruption of scandal was immediate and overwhelming. News of the emperor's excesses, once whispered in secret, now exploded into the open. Pamphlets and speeches denounced his orgies, his cruelty, and his disregard for tradition. The Senate moved quickly to distance itself, declaring the emperor a tyrant and erasing his name from monuments and coins. The people of Rome, who had once watched the palace with fascination and envy, now turned their backs in disgust or relief. The palace itself was purged, favorites exiled, rivals elevated, and the rituals of excess replaced by a new, austere order. Yet, the aftermath was far from simple. The scars left by the emperor's reign ran deep. The city, already teetering on the edge, was left with a legacy of mistrust and division. Old alliances had been shattered, and new ones were fragile. The Senate, emboldened by its victory, struggled to restore stability, but the memory of the emperor's downfall lingered, a warning of how quickly power could corrupt, and how easily pleasure could become poison. For those who had survived the palace, the lessons were bitter. Some faded into obscurity, haunted by memories of nights spent in the emperor's shadow. Others reinvented themselves, using their knowledge of the court's secrets to secure new positions or fortunes. A few, marked by scandal, became cautionary tales, reminders of the price paid for ambition, indulgence, or misplaced trust. For Rome itself, the end of the emperor's orgies marked the close of an era. The city would never again be quite so dazzled, or so reckless. The story of the emperor who turned his palace into an orgy became a legend, retold in hushed tones and cautionary verses. It was a tale of brilliance and ruin, of the heights of pleasure and the depths of despair, and of the fragile line between power and self-destruction. As we move to our final reflection, we must ask, what does this story reveal about the human need for connection, the dangers of unchecked desire, and the cost of forgetting our own limits? The answers, as we'll see, are as relevant now as they were in the shadowed halls of the imperial palace. The story of the emperor who turned his palace into an orgy is more than a tale of scandal and spectacle. It is a meditation on the deepest needs and vulnerabilities of the human heart. At its core, this is a story about the seductive pull of power and the ways it can isolate even the most celebrated among us. Surrounded by luxury, flattery, and endless entertainment, the emperor was never truly alone. Yet he was never more isolated. The very rituals meant to fill the void only deepened it, turning pleasure into performance and intimacy into a transaction. Unchecked desire, whether for novelty, control, or validation, can become a prison. The emperor's hunger for excitement and affirmation led him to create a world where nothing was off limits, but also where nothing was truly meaningful. The more he indulged, the more elusive satisfaction became. The palace, once a symbol of Rome's greatness, became a monument to loneliness, a place where trust was impossible and every relationship was shadowed by suspicion. Yet, the emperor's story is not just a warning about the dangers of excess. It is also a call to empathy and restraint, a reminder that behind every headline and legend lies a human being, flawed, searching, and often afraid. The people who passed through the palace, favorites, rivals, lovers, and servants, were not just characters in a drama, but individuals with hopes, fears, and dreams of their own. Their suffering, their resilience, and their longing for connection are as real as any triumph or tragedy recorded in marble or ink. As we close this chapter, let us remember that true greatness is not measured by the heights of pleasure or the reach of power, but by the capacity for compassion, humility, and self-awareness. The lessons of the emperor's fall are timeless. That unchecked desire can destroy, that loneliness can haunt even the most gilded halls, and that the stories of the forgotten matter. In the end, it is our willingness to see the humanity in others, and in ourselves, that shapes the legacy we leave behind. Now that you've glimpsed the secrets and shadows of the imperial palace, what would you have done in the emperor's world? Would you have played the game, risked everything for favor, or tried to hold on to your integrity in a place where trust was a luxury? Share your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Your perspective adds depth to the story and helps us all see history through new eyes. If this journey into Rome's most scandalous chapter left you questioning the true cost of power and pleasure, you're not alone. Join our community of curious minds by subscribing and turning on notifications, so you never miss a story that history tried to bury. Stay curious, stay questioning, and remember, the past is never as distant as it seems.